Chapter 1, Introduction to Child Psychology. One question you should ask yourself is why you're taking this class. Why is it important to study children? So your future career may involve caring for children, educating children. Maybe you currently are a parent or you plan to be, or maybe you just hope to gain insight into your own childhood. Either way, the more you know about the development of children, the better you can guide them. I hope that in this class, you will find that the study of child development is very intriguing and informative. Your textbook gives an example of some topics we'll be studying in this class. Compare and contrast these individuals. First, we have Ted Kaczynski, who grew up as an isolated, misunderstood child. He did not have friends, he graduated high school early, and started at Harvard at age 16. Even in his professional career, he isolated himself. When he was arrested for setting 16 mail bombs that injured 23 people and killed 3, he traced his difficulties to growing up as a genius in a kid's body and sticking out like a sore thumb in surroundings as a child. Now consider a different person. Think about Alice Walker. She grew up in the South in the 40s. She grew up in poverty and battling racism. At age 8, her brother accidentally shot her in the eye with a BB gun that left her disfigured and blind. Despite everything that was against her, she went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for her book, The Color Purple, and had a very successful career. These individuals both had challenging childhoods and were both full of promise. So, what caused them to go into two totally different directions? Think about that for a minute and jot down some of your ideas. So, normally, obviously, if we were in person, we would be having a group discussion about this, but just to throw out some ideas, um, some things you might consider are physical development. So, what kind of impacts do you think that being disfigured might have on a child's development? They might be left out of friend groups or those kinds of things. It might make them self-conscious. Obviously, that didn't affect her success in her career, but it might have affected her in her personal life. Think about social development and being and not having any friends and what kind of impact that might have on a child. But obviously, even though they both had bad things in their past, it didn't they didn't ultimately end up in a bad place. They went in two different directions. So one of the things we're going to talk about this semester over and over again is how these areas of development, physical, cognitive, and social slash emotional, interact with each other, but also how it's not predetermined. So your genes, your environment, all of that comes into play as well to determine how you're actually going to end up. So you can't look at someone and say, oh, well, they had a bad childhood. That means they're going to be a serial killer or something like that. That's not how it works. Okay, so I mentioned that we are going to be talking about the three major domains of study this whole semester. So the first one is biological, or how I usually refer to it as physical development. This refers to changes in the body. So things like your genetics, your height, your weight, your motor skills, hormone changes during puberty, all those kinds of things fall under physical development. Then we have cognitive development, which refers to changes in thought, intelligence, and language. So this domain covers things like learning how to put together a sentence, memorizing a poem, solving a math problem, or even imagining what your future career is going to be. And then lastly, we have socio-emotional, which refers to changes in relationships with others, changes in emotions, and changes in personality. This domain includes topics such as a child's attachment to their mother and father, displays of aggression or joy, developing personality, all those kinds of things. So like I mentioned already, these domains do not stand alone. They're all very much intertwined. So consider a baby smiling in response to a parent's touch. What biological processes would be at play here? So think about it this way. Um, your situation as a baby smiling to a parent touching them. So the physical part of it would be the actual touch, feeling the touch and responding to it physically. Cognitively, the baby has the ability to understand intentional actions that the parent is touching them, but also the parent has the cognitive ability to be able to realize that the baby is smiling at them. And then in the social domain, you have the smiling that reflects a positive emotion and it helps us form connections with others. And actually, you'll learn in future chapters that smiling is one of the few ways that babies can communicate with us. And just quickly, this is a chart from the book that covers the periods of development. So at the bottom, we have the processes we just talked about, and then it just goes through the different age ranges we're going to talk about this semester. So your textbook is split up into prenatal period, infancy, early childhood, middle and late childhood, and then adolescence. So you can read more about the different ages and stuff like that in your textbook because that's pretty straightforward. The next topic we're going to talk about are the debates in development. So these are debates between child psychologists, essentially. The first one is called Nature and Nurture, which you may have heard about in previous classes. Essentially, the early developmental psychologists debated whether nature or nurture was more responsible for human development. Nature refers to one's genetics, so your traits or abilities that you get from your parents, and nurture refers to the environmental influences that shape one's behavior. So the debate was which one is stronger on your development. If you didn't grow up with your genetic parents, you were just born and immediately adopted out to a different family, would you be more like your genetic parents or more like your adopted parents? If you had twins that grew up separately, would they be similar to each other if they grew up completely apart with different sets of parents? That's the debate. So well, it was a debate. Pretty much now we know that it's both, so it's not one or the other. They both very strongly influence our development. This video I'm going to link on Blackboard so you can watch it. It gives you a really great example of twins that grew up separated, so you can see if they turned out pretty similar or pretty different. That'll be linked on Blackboard. The other issue I wanted to talk about, the other debate, was early and later experiences, because this is pretty similar. So with this debate, it's about the issue of the degree to which early experiences or later experiences are the key determinants of the child's development. So the key question being debated is if an infant experiences harmful circumstances, can those experiences be overcome by later positive ones? Or are the early experiences so critical that their influence cannot be overridden by a later, better environment? So proponents of early experiences suggest that if an infant does not receive warm, nurturing care during the first year or so of life, their development will never be optimal. In contrast, proponents of later experiences argue that children are malleable throughout their development and that later experiences of caregiving are just as important. So essentially, this question is asking if it's kind of similar. It's just that it's specifically about the first year of life because that's called a critical period. There are different critical and sensitive periods across development, but let's focusing on just the beginning of life. That is considered a very critical period for developing socio-emotional skills and cognitive abilities as well. So if an infant is taken care of properly, they should develop fine. If they're not, then they're going to struggle cognitively, socially, emotionally. So if you have, I'm sure you've seen examples of children that were raised in horrible conditions from birth. Maybe they never had any kind of physical touch or anything. They don't grow up very well. They might not be able to talk. They may not be able to approach people or have any kind of relationship. So that's what it's talking about. So if you took that child that grew up in very horrible conditions, but let's say when they're 5, they get to an adopted home that really takes care of them and gives them all the care that they need and more, do you think that that child would be able to then optimally develop, or do you think the damage is done? And that's what this debate is about. So you can be on one side or the other on that one, but that's the main gist of that debate. The next thing we're going to talk about are the different theories in child development. So there are several different theories that provide multiple perspectives on the stages of childhood development. So not one theory explains all the questions that exist in child development, and the theories often complement each other. So there are several listed in your book. We're not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to go over a couple here and explain a little more in depth. So this first one is called Erikson's Stages of Psychosocial Development. This one you're going to see show up in each life stage that we talk about this semester, so I wanted to talk about it briefly. Um, so this one is listed in your textbook along with Freud's theory. I don't talk about Freud because that's more of a history lesson. Nobody actually uses that theory anymore, and it's not talked about again in your textbook. So we're skipping ahead to Erikson here. So Erikson believed that the primary motivation for human development was social. So we like to be social. Humans are very social in nature, and we have a desire to affiliate with others. Erikson's theory encompasses the entire lifespan. So this class ends with adolescence, but his theory goes on into adulthood as well. So that's pretty cool. Um, Erikson was a later experience advocate and believed that later life experiences were just as important as early ones. So we just talked about that. So Erikson believed that if you mess up in the first couple of stages, you can still recover later in life. So in Erikson's theory, each stage brings a crisis that an individual must resolve. The more successfully they resolve the crisis, the healthier their development will be. So let's just go over the first stage and you can read about the rest. So the first stage is, you can see on here, is infancy. And the stage is trust versus mistrust. So an infant gains trust with their caregiver and comes to believe that the world will be a good and pleasant place to live. They do this by being, when the caregiver feeds them, cuddles them, sings to them, gives them warmth, changes their diaper, all those kinds of things, um, makes the infant trust the caregiver. An infant also begins to develop a sense of autonomy, and if they are restrained too much or punished too harshly, they may develop a sense of shame or doubt, which is the second stage. So we've moved from trust to versus mistrust. Infancy also has autonomy versus shame and doubt. So basically, let's stick with trust versus mistrust. If they develop that trust, that they pass that stage essentially, and they'll have a healthy development from the beginning. If the infant is not taken care of, then they would develop mistrust, which means they would be pretty mistrusting in later stages of development as well. So in your textbook, you can read about all the rest of these stages, and you'll read about them more in depth when we get to these chapters as well. So those were these more unconscious theories. This next section is about cognitive development theories. And the main difference between these are that cognitive theories focus on conscious thought rather than unconscious thought. So this first slide is about Piaget's cognitive development theory. Again, we're going to read about this in every life stage chapter. So we're not going to go too in depth now. This is just a brief overview so you can see the different stages. So Piaget's theory starts in infancy and actually ends in adolescence. So there's more current theories now that have either added on to Piaget's theory or created their own that goes throughout the entire lifespan rather than ending at adolescence. But he has these 4 different stages that he thinks we go through as we develop, and it's very tied to your physical development as well. So as your brain grows, as your body grows, as your motor skills grow, you're going to be able to do different things that allow you to develop cognitively as well. And again, we're going to get more in depth on these as we go through the textbook. The next theory is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. This is also a cognitive theory, but Vygotsky's theory doesn't have stages like Piaget's. His theory is very strongly focused on cultural influences and social interaction. So he believed that children develop by learning from their surroundings, basically. So they learn from elders, so it could be parents, teachers, siblings, whatever is around them. That's how they learn. He also believed that cultural tools were really important. So you might learn how to count using a computer, but in a different culture, you might learn how to count using beads or something like that. The last cognitive theory is called the information processing theory. This theory also has no stages, but instead says that children develop a gradually increasing capacity for processing information, which allows them to acquire increasingly complex knowledge and skills. This theory is modeled off how computers work. And again, we're going to talk about this more in depth as well later in the textbook, but basically there's an input and output. So like you take in information, you process it, and then that results in some kind of output. So let's say, for example, the input is I hear my cat meowing downstairs. So my ears take in that information to my brain processes it, and my output to that stimulus is to go feed my cat. It makes me get up and go feed my cat. So that's basically the information processing theory. Okay, so that was cognitive, and now we also have a separate area of theories which focus on behavioral processes and social processes. So the first one is Pavlov's classical conditioning, which you may have heard of already because you probably heard of Pavlov's dogs. Um, Basically, this is where he conditioned dogs to respond to the sound of a bell. Um, so I'll kind of walk you through it real quick in case you haven't heard of it, but I'm also going to link a video to kind of show you more how it works as well on Blackboard. But basically, with classical conditioning, and this works on humans as well as animals. So uh, follow along on the chart here. So before your conditioning, you have what you call a neutral stimulus. So that would be the sound of a bell. Um, and the response that you eventually want the dog to have is salivation. So before conditioning, you just have this random bell. The dog has no reaction to the bell. So you ring the bell, the dog does nothing. Now, the conditioning part happens in the second stage here, where you have, again, your neutral stimulus, the bell, and you pair it with an unconditioned stimulus, which is, in this case, food. So you ring a bell, present the bowl of food, and then the dog salivates when they smell the food. So you do this over and over again until eventually, after conditioning, you can ring the bell with no food present and the dog salivates to the sound of the bell now. Because what happened is the dog now associates the unconditioned stimulus being the food with the neutral stimulus, which is the bell. And now you don't even need the food present for the dog to salivate in response to the sound of the bell. So I'm sure you can think of examples of this in your life as well. If you have pets, especially, it's really simple. Um, my cat is kind of weird where he likes to play with ice cubes. So anytime that he hears the freezer open and the ice, he can hear the ice. So he runs downstairs, even if he's like in a dead sleep and isn't wanting to play. It's like he can't help himself because he knows he's getting overboard of playtime. He does the same thing when we open the front door. When he hears the doorbell go off, he runs to the door because he thinks he's going to get a piece of grass to chew on or something. So we see it a lot in our pets, but you can do this in humans as well if you wanted to, uh, for some reason, train someone to have a certain response to something. You may see this in like if you have an aversion to food or an irrational fear, that might explain some of these things. So there's actually another story you may have heard of. It's called the Baby Albert story. And this was actually a different psychologist, was John Watson, who discovered that this theory could be applied to humans. So what he did was he had a baby who he would present with a rabbit, and the baby loved the rabbit, very excited about it. But then he would present the rabbit and then make a really loud noise after so that the baby would cry. And the baby was crying because of the noise, not the rabbit. But he paired them together, so eventually he would present the rabbit without the loud noise, and the baby would cry in response to the rabbit now. So you see how that could probably explain if you have a fear of heights or um, aversion to spaghetti, because maybe one time you got really sick after eating spaghetti, and it might not have been the spaghetti that made you sick, but because you associate those things together, now you don't want to eat spaghetti ever again. So that can apply to animals and humans. Now, a similar theory, but something that's a little different, is Skinner's operant conditioning. So this is just a slightly different form of conditioning. This one involves reward and punishment. So basically, the idea behind it is that when consequences of a behavior produce changes in the probability that the behavior will occur again. So a positive consequence is something like a parent that smiles at their child when they say mom. So that reward of the smile is likely going to increase the behavior. So it's going to increase the child saying the word mom. A negative consequence or punishment is something that you take away. So, like a parent taking away a cell phone when their teenager misses curfew. So that will likely decrease the probability of the behavior occurring again. So again, operant conditioning is you're either rewarding the behavior to increase it or you're punishing the behavior to decrease it. And reward and punishment can be kind of confusing because reward is always adding something into the equation, whereas punishment is always taking something away. Next, in your book, we have Bandura's social cognitive theory. The basis for this theory is that children learn by watching others. That's essentially all it is. So, for example, a boy watches his father act aggressively towards others, and then with his peers, the child also acts aggressively because that's how he saw his dad acting. So simple as that. Children learn by watching you. So you see how all of these can be true at the same time. So you wouldn't say, well, I only believe in Skinner's operant conditioning. All the others don't even make sense because they all work together at the same time. It's not one or the other. You could really kind of take bits and pieces from each theory and put them all together. And just really quickly, this is a picture from your textbook. This was, I think, one of the last theories discussed, Bronfenbrenner's theory. And it just kind of shows that I really like this theory because it shows how everything around you really affects your development. So he split it up into different systems. So in the middle, you have the individual, so you, so your sex, your age, your health, everything about you. But then we go out beyond that and go to your microsystem. So that includes the school you go to, your friends, your family, um, your neighborhood, those kinds of things. And then you move out even further and you go to your friends of your family, the media, social welfare services, legal services, your neighbors. Even further, you have the culture that you're living in. And you see all these arrows are saying that all of these things interact with each other to make you you, essentially. So it's not just about what is in your house or even on your street. It goes out farther than that into your community. What kind of community do you live in? What kind of culture do you live in? And what are the values of that culture? And all of those things affect you. And then you see, even on the outside, it even includes time. So in your textbook, it talks about history graded influences and how growing up in a certain time period can have influences on your development as well. Okay, lastly, there is a section in your textbook about research methods. So I'm going to have this video and then a couple others linked on Blackboard as well for you to watch to cover that because it is kind of intense and a lot to talk about, and this video is already kind of long. You're not going to have any assignments necessarily about research methods, but it is really important to understand so that you can understand the rest of the information we cover this semester. So I would suggest at least picking one of the videos to watch, just so you have a basic understanding of how research works and how it doesn't, because there's a lot of stuff out right now about fake news and research studies and is science even real and all those kinds of things. And like, you really need to have an understanding about when your textbook says this study found X, Y, and Z, what actually does that mean? So I do encourage you to either watch this video or I'm going to link a Last Week Tonight with John Oliver video that does explain very well as well. But that's it for chapter 1. So you can go ahead and move on to your assignments in the lessons folder on Blackboard.